It's a privilege to join you for the 17th Annual Robinson Packwood Memorial Lecture, an event that continues to honor two of Bermuda's most respected historians and their commitment to preserving our shared history. As a former educator, I've always believed that understanding where we come from helps us to better understand who we are today. History gives us context, but it also challenges us to look honestly at the experiences that have shaped our country. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Neil Kennedy, Professor of Atlantic History of Memorial University in St. John's, Canada. Dr. Kennedy has conducted historical and archaeological research across the Atlantic world, including here in Bermuda, at Hog Bay and Castle Island. For the past decade, his work has focused on enslavement, resistance, and emancipation in Bermuda, and his research has been published in leading academic journals. His work is a valuable reminder that there's always more to learn about our past. By examining the records, places, and evidence left behind, we can deepen our understanding for the people and forces that shaped Bermuda. This is important because history is not simply about looking backwards. It helps us to have more honest conversations about the present and think more thoughtfully about the future that we want to build. I thank the Department of Culture for organizing this event and Dr. Kennedy for sharing his scholarship with us. I encourage everyone to listen, I know you will, with open minds, ask questions, and to continue the important work of understanding and preserving Bermuda's story. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy this evening's lecture.
We now welcome poet and author Matthew Johnston to share his piece.
I have a poem for you all this evening entitled Atlantic Songs. I have always known salt water as healer. The way ocean washes over wound as remedy. Often, I have gone to the shore of Atlantic, gently sinking my body into ocean's embrace, letting the tides freely mingle with exposed tissue while listening to waves fall into each other, making music of their restlessness. There are times that I wonder about the sacred of Atlantic songs, imagining them the sound of ancestors that saw ocean as freedom, as escape, while clutching prayers of rebirth before plunging into ocean and filling lungs with Atlantic. Ocean carries ancestral screams, stories entwined in throats, a haunting choir of last breaths, the ocean floor, an Atlantis of souls. Left behind bone becomes monument, the water a viable coffin. Atlantic wears trauma on its back. Spine twists itself into shape of sacrifice, with belly already lined with past offerings. Ocean becomes altar. Buried in waves are miles of memories of souls that saw deliverance in afterlife. A trail of black bodies mosaicked into path homeward, carrying songs that echo womb, melodious sounds of voice and ocean stirring into orchestra. I have always known that ocean brings healing, but some wounds linger. Maybe that's why ocean often breaks its silence, why the waves can be so unruly, why God always troubles this water, why the thought of home feels so tempestuous. I sink deeper into ocean, reveling in the gentle of this ritual, letting the salt mend me tender as spirits cloak me in their songs. Call this divine, baptismal, as their souls wash over me. I try making ocean of myself to house such hallowed chorus. I make epitaph of my bones in tribute and submerge within my blood in search of home, in search of restoration. In search of familiar melody rising from the mouth of Atlantic, a symphony of sweet sound swelling in ocean, reminding me how sometimes sacrifice is prelude to healing. Thank you.
Tonight's lecture will be given by Dr. Neil Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is a professor of Atlantic history at Memorial University in St. John's, Canada. Trained first as a historical archaeologist and historian of the 17th century Atlantic world. Dr. Kennedy has worked in the Dutch Caribbean and in Bermuda at Hog Bay and Castle Island. Over the last decade, he has focused on the history of slavery, resistance, and the emancipation process in Bermuda. His work that has been published in the Journal of Caribbean History and the leading journal, Slavery and Abolition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Neil Kennedy.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and this very warm welcome. As always in Bermuda, it's been my privilege to work here for nearly 3 decades now, and it's always been a magnificent experience, a really great experience. So thank you all for your, and I'd really like to note my agreement with your words, sir. History is an act of interpretation, right? This is not an end point, right? This is a beginning point. So thank you very much. And it's a great honor to be able to do my small part of honoring Dr. Robinson and Mr. Packwood, whose work has meant a tremendous amount to me, especially over the last 15 years or so. And it was that remark, a passing remark, and one of those subtly pointed remarks in Chained on the Rock that really led me to change my research from the 17th century. That remark, if slavery was so benign, why did people run from it? And that has really shaped my research for the last 15 years or so. So it's a great honor to do a little bit to try and acknowledge this important work. And both books, Chained on the Rock and Heritage, are never far from my desk in my office back in St. John's, for sure, because both books are so original in a few things. One, the importance of thinking about family as a source of identity and security. But also in both books, we're ahead of their time in acknowledging and noting that while we find and locate people in records, people are not contained by those records. They're not captured by those records. They are much more than that. And that has been animating, I hope, my work for some time. Okay, so for tonight, I'd like to talk about an incident from 1827 and think about that incident in a larger Atlantic context, and then think a little bit about how that larger context in the British Empire was shaped by what happened here in 1827. So it's a little bit of a back and forth. I came across this incident relatively recently, and so quite a bit of it, or not quite a bit, but some of it is still a little bit unclear to me, and it's become immensely complex. I now have hundreds of pages of documents about this one incident across many archives in Europe and, of course, here in Bermuda. And so I'm going to try and simplify it quite a bit tonight, but it is a quite legally and politically complex issue, but we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. And so the subject is the intercolonial slave trade, the transportation of enslaved people between British colonies in the 1820s. And the 1820s are a really important transitional period in the British Empire in which the anti-slavery movement was still trying to find purchase, still trying to find popular support. Meanwhile, many of the changes in imperial policy were being reacted to by colonial elites who saw them as threatening their liberties and their identities. And so the 1820s has become increasingly a subject of attention to imperial historians, and this incident fits really nicely in there and then plays an important role, as I hope to show. And so our story tonight begins with this ship. His Majesty's sloop Orestes, built in 1824, the 5th ship in the Royal Navy with that name. Now, those with sharp ears, if you've seen the blockbuster film this summer, The Odyssey, you will have heard the name Orestes mentioned twice, although you never actually see anyone named Orestes. So Orestes, in Greek mythology, was the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, and it's Orestes who kills his mother, Clytemnestra, in revenge for her having killed Agamemnon for sacrificing their daughter. 2 scenes that are seen in the film. So Orestes is not critical to this story, but it is striking that Orestes in Greek mythology is a metaphor for purification, a metaphor for righteous vengeance. And so keep that in mind as we think about the Orestes and what lies ahead here. Now, the Orestes between 1826 and 1830 was captained by a man named William Jones. And so William Jones is a name that will figure prominently throughout this story, because the story unfolds over essentially 4 years. And William Jones is a major player in that. In 1826, when he takes command of Orestes, he is 34 years old, so he's mid-career. The Orestes was stationed in Halifax and Newfoundland, where I live now, as part of the fleet that protected the cod and herring fisheries up there. And he's involved in all kinds of interesting things. Archdeacon Spencer, who serves in Bermuda, he's carried to Bermuda on the Orestes under William Jones. And so it's connected to all kinds of interesting elements here. This painting, which I found recently, depicts an incident in 1826 when he nearly runs into an iceberg off of Labrador. And so we have a nice painting of the Orestes from this period. Now, all the evidence I have about William Jones suggests he is a kind of typical 19th century Royal Navy officer. He's ambitious, he's well educated, he writes poetry that's in the Royal Gazette, and he is also really deeply imbued in a new 19th century idea of empire as powerful, as centralized, and that it should be in London, in which purpose and power is felt, not negotiated with the colonies, but expressed in London. And that is part of this story as we go. Now, one of the purposes, or one of the tasks of the Orestes was to carry mail between Canada and Bermuda, which gets us to our story, right? And so it's on one of those occasions when the Orestes is in Bermuda that the events I want to talk about unfold. Fortunately, and somewhat amazingly, the figurehead of the Orestes survives and is in the Portsmouth Museum, so we can see what the ship looked like in 1824. Now, 2 Bermuda books do talk about the incident I wanted to talk about. Gene Kennedy in 1962, and then Henry Wilkinson in 1973, although he largely copies what Gene Kennedy has written about. And so it has been mentioned before, but in pretty abbreviated form, very briefly. And both books make substantial factual errors. They both make pretty unwarranted assumptions about what was going on, and both also really narrativize the events. That is, they seek, or they identify desires and motives that really aren't very clear in the documents at all. And so that's a bit of a problem. Typical of both books, they also see politics as simply challenges between local white elites. That is, there's no real space in either accounts for the empire or for someone like William Jones, who's come from the outside and is inserting himself in this context. And so they're both problematic. And I think by both narrativizing the events, by also seeing politics as largely about local white elite debates, they excuse quite a bit of what happens here and also obscure what was at stake. And a great deal was at stake in the episode I want to talk about. Okay, and so what is the episode? The episode involves a Bermuda ship, the Adelaide. And so early in the morning of the 27th of January, 1827, the Bermuda brig Adelaide, which was anchored in the Sound just off of Dockyard, was boarded and searched by Captain William Jones and the crew of the Orestes. The ship had cleared out of Hamilton the day before, but anchored in the Sound overnight waiting for favorable winds. And it's at that moment in the morning before it can leave the Sound that Captain Jones boards the ship. The Adelaide was bound for Trinidad at this point. What Captain Jones found on board, that is what he expected to find, was multiple violations of the intercolonial slave trade laws. He wrote that what he uncovered, he called a system of slave trading in Bermuda. And perhaps a little bit dramatic. He's kind of a dramatic guy. He says what's happening in Bermuda undermines the integrity and purpose of the whole British Empire. And so a serious challenge. And so this is the manifest for the Adelaide that was issued in Hamilton on the 17th of January, a few days before it set sail. And you can see at the top here, it's marked not to be posted. That is, the voyage has not been undertaken. So what did he find? Or rather, who did he find on the Adelaide? First of all, John Perenchief, the captain, or more properly the master of the Adelaide, and the ship's crew of 5 men, who I've listed there, including 2 enslaved men, Jim and Edgar. Those 2 men were owned by John Wainwright, who was the owner of the Adelaide, of the ship itself. And the Adelaide was named for his daughter, Adelaide. In fact, John Wainwright was on that ship to go and visit his daughter, who was resident in Trinidad. And his daughter, Adelaide, had just married in Trinidad the manager of the warehouse that John Wainwright and his business partner, John Stowe Wainwright, had in Port of Spain in Trinidad. And so he was going to visit her. With Wainwright were two enslaved children, Bob, around 10 years old, and Belinda, around 6 years old, who are listed in the clearance papers as in attendance upon him, which was the language required by the law, for reasons we'll see in a second. They're listed as domestic servants, that is, domestic servants being the code word, the polite code in the 1820s for household slave. And so we'll see that phrase a number of times. John Wainwright said he was taking Bob to visit his mother in Trinidad, Bob's mother in Trinidad. Almost certainly, though, he was taking both children to give as a wedding present to his daughter Adelaide in Trinidad, which would have been an illegal act at the time. A further 3 white passengers on the Adelaide were returning to Trinidad, and they are the McAllisters, a mother, father, and a little girl, Anne, who's described as a babe in arms in a number of the documents. They had brought with them from Trinidad to Bermuda, and were taking her back to Trinidad, a free woman of color who was presumably the nurse for the infant, whose name in hundreds of pages of documents is never mentioned. She's only mentioned twice. She's literally erased from the documents, and so I don't know who she is, unfortunately. Described as in attendance upon the McAllisters was an enslaved family group. The mother, Hannah, who's described as a laundress, who had lost the use of one eye, her daughters, Alan and Sue, and her sons, Daniel and Wellington. Now, of course, this is a partial family group. No father in the hundreds of pages is ever mentioned. She had a son already in Trinidad, and it's never explained how he's already in Trinidad. That part is left aside. And one document indicates that she had 3 other children in Bermuda, including one who was extremely ill. But there's only one reference to that, so I'm uncertain if that is quite the case. Now, having searched the Adelaide, found what he was expecting to find, William Jones seizes the Adelaide as a prize and submits the case to the Vice Admiralty Court here in Bermuda for prosecution. Now, the potential penalties were very high. Loss of the ship to John Wainwright, £100 fine per enslaved person to the slaveholders for each individual. So 200 to Wainwright, 500 to McAllister, and 700 to Parent Chief as the master of the ship carrying illegally those individuals. The slave law at this point even allowed up to the execution, and well, I guess there's nothing past execution, but up to execution and the transportation for 14 years, or the transportation for 14 years to a penal colony of slaveholders. But what was the case? What was the legal case for prosecution? There are really 3 critical issues here that will then play out over, as I say, over the next 3 to 4 years. The first issue had to do with documentation. That is, the Adelaide and the Wainwright and McAllister lacked the required documentation to transport enslaved people between colonies at this point, for 2 reasons. One, that 2 of these children were too young to be recorded on a Bermuda slave register, which had existed in 1821 and then expired in 1822, and they were born after that fact. So there was no record of them in the register, which was required by British law. The other reason the documentation failed was that none of the children's occupations are described on the clearance papers, which was also a requirement of British law. And so nothing's listed for them. The second aspect of the case, the second important element, is that they're also children, of course, right? That they are very young. And so the second issue then was, how can it be that an infant can be a domestic servant to a babe in arms? The third question that's related to both of those, was it legal in 1827 for someone to come from one colony to another, purchase enslaved people, and transport them with the intention of transporting them back to another colony? And that question was to be worked out in the process of this case. There's actually an additional 4th issue involving some salt pork and beef that Wainwright had just bought in Virginia that was hidden on the Adelaide, and that was illegal after 1824. But it's too complex, so we'll just leave that aside. But there is actually a 4th issue. And for someone like Jones, that it wasn't a minor issue. He thought this was all part and parcel with the system of evading law in Bermuda. John Wainwright said in response to that, "What is not expressly forbidden is allowed." The kind of language that just incensed someone like Jones, who saw himself as a manifestation of a centralizing, protective empire, whatever we might think of that, in the 1820s. Now, like his father, John Wainwright, and like many merchants in the Atlantic world, was no stranger to run-ins with imperial law. He'd had a ship seized in the 1810s in the Caribbean for having a non-British sailor on board, an American sailor. But who were the McAllisters, or sort of principal element of this story? The McAllisters, not long before 1827, had emigrated to Trinidad from Scotland, and they were part of a wave of new migration to Trinidad I'll talk about in just a second. So this is in relation to the seizure of Trinidad in 1797, and then the Trinidad becoming a part of the British Empire. And so by the 1820s, Trinidad was a kind of Wild West in a way. There was large influxes of migrants, Scots, Irish, some English, some Germans, and so on. And then also planters from older colonies, Barbados and Jamaica, where the soil was largely worn out for sugar, who were going to Trinidad, which at that point was largely underpopulated and had been largely occupied by the French living under Spanish law and had not been kind of extensively developed. So those are our players, the actors in this story. Now, in terms of Trinidad, Britain was torn between different imperatives here. One, to encourage the potential for new sugar plantations in Trinidad, and it's a very newly acquired colony, but also balancing that was in terms of attention was an awareness of the need to rein in the ambitions of slave owners by the 1810s and 1820s, that there ought to be some limit to that. Is one reason why Trinidad was kept as a crown colony without an elected legislature, was to try and rein in the planters who were flooding into Trinidad, and other colonies acquired as a result of the French wars, like Demerara and Berbice, places that will become British Guyana a little bit later on. So Trinidad was the site of the British Empire's first attentions to try and regulate and monitor the movement of enslaved people between the colonies. And so Trinidad was the first place to require registration of the slave population in 1812, as the empire tried to pay attention to and monitor the sudden growth of the enslaved population. And so parliamentary papers for a number of years exist. These are the papers for just before the Adelaide incident, as part of that effort to monitor. And in those records, we find that there are 84 enslaved people, at least 84 enslaved people, transported from Bermuda to Trinidad legally under license in that period. 22 of that 84 were transported by John Wainwright. Right? So he's a substantial player in Bermuda's small part in that intercolonial slave trade. Some of those 84 people were also taken to Trinidad accompanying Bermudians, people like John Stowe Wainwright, who had been in Trinidad since around 1823 or so, or the Joels, the William Joel plantation. Bermuda's estate appears a number of times in the Protector of Slave records in Trinidad for neglect of ill people, and so on. And so there's a small but substantial Bermuda presence in Trinidad by this point. Meanwhile, in 1824, the Colonial Office instructed Bermuda's governor to get the legislature to renew the imperial instructions of 1819 to produce a slave register every 3 years. Now remember, Bermuda's 1821 register had expired in 1822 and had not been renewed. So in 1824, the Colonial Office requests the renewal of that. And again, the intention of the slave register was to monitor the population, and particularly to monitor and try and prevent the separation of families. Bermuda's Assembly's response, what you can see here, is indignation that the register was unnecessary in Bermuda because Bermuda was not engaged in any way in slave trade. Though we have just seen that that is in fact not the case. And the Bermuda House of Assembly took 3 more years before they reluctantly passed the Slave Register Act, which produces the 1827 register after the Adelaide. The lack of a slave register in Bermuda has some unexpected effects. The same month that the Adelaide was seized by William Jones, a London firm petitions the Colonial Office for a license to transport 50 enslaved Bermudians to Trinidad. And they say specifically the reason they want to do this is that because Bermudian slaves did not live under what they called the comfort of a registry, they would be better off in Trinidad. Now, that is a remarkably cynical petition, and the Colonial Office just ignored it quite rightly. But nonetheless, the lack of registry was identified, right, as a source of contention. At the same time, that the House of Assembly was arguing that Bermudians were not involved in the slave trade, the Colonial Secretary of Bermuda, Robert Kennedy, was recording the exports of enslaved people out of Bermuda over the 3 years that the Colonial Office requested that information. This is just the year for the page for 1824. Repeatedly, Bermuda governors wrote that enslaved Bermudians dreaded transfer to Trinidad. It was the greatest calamity that can befall them, wrote one governor in 1829. That tells us two things, I think. One, that the threat of transportation and family separation served as an element of coercion and control. It also tells us the way that enslaved people resisted by expressing their concerns, their protests about the risk of transportation. Okay, so that's quite a bit so far already before we even really got to the case itself. But just if you think of it in maybe three bullet points. One, that Bermuda was a participant in the intercolonial slave trade in the 1810s and 1820s, as well as the much more poorly documented slave trade out of the British Empire, particularly to the USA and to Cuba. And if you think of someone like Benjamin Benson, whose narrative I found a couple of years ago, he and many of his brothers and sisters are sold to the U.S. In that period. The second bullet point, I think, to keep in mind is that, as you saw in the Adelaide, on the list of the age of those children, that the slave trade in the 19th century, for lots of complex reasons, had substantially shifted to the transportation of children and away from adults. And that was all across the Atlantic world, but we see it here in Bermuda as well. Remember, Benjamin Benson is 12 years old when he is sold to the U.S. Bermuda's Governor Turner in 1826 wrote that in Bermuda, quote, children sell for very little. And that is responding to and identifying this transition. The third element would be that John Wainwright is the most active participant in Bermuda in that intercolonial slave trade. Okay. Next, we need to think just briefly about the law, what is actually the law at stake here. The specific law that Adelaide was prosecuted under was the 1824 Consolidated Slave Trade Act, which is sometimes called the Slave Piracy Act because one of the elements of the Consolidated Slave Trade Act was making the illegal slave trade equivalent to an act of piracy. That is, it could result in your execution as a capital crime. Right? So that's sometimes called the Slave Piracy Act. The Consolidated Slave Trade Act of 1824 was part of really 2 decades of efforts to try and control, regulate the movement of labor between colonies, especially movement from the non-sugar colonies, the small islands, to the larger islands, and from the worn-out colonies, the big islands, to a big island like Trinidad or to British Guyana. First, we have the Act to Prevent the Importation of Slaves in 1806, which came into effect in 1807, which banned the British participation in the transatlantic slave trade, but said nothing about the transportation, or did not ban the transportation of enslaved people between British colonies. But they did try to do some things which will become important to what happened subsequently. In trying to also to balance the tension between allowing for adjustments in labor flows, but also trying to rein in the excesses of the planters. The 1806 law introduced the requirement for documentation. And so a number of the documentations that were lacking in the Adelaide case are introduced already in 1806 and come into effect in 1807. And this is, again, an attempt to try and monitor, regulate, and limit the transfer of enslaved people to those new colonies. Important for us is one of those rules, which added that if you were transporting only 2 enslaved people per free person, then none of the licensing requirements of the 1806 Act were in effect. So as long as you stayed for 2 or below, now you'll notice McAllister had purchased 5 individuals amongst the 3 of them, right? So he is trying to stay underneath that 2 person per owner rule, which was introduced in 1806. Now that only applied, that ability to evade the licensing requirements only applied if those 2 individuals or up to 2 individuals were what they call domestic servants. Evidence that the regulations weren't working, that they weren't effectively curbing the intercolonial slave trade, resulted in 1811 in the Slave Trade Felony Act, which made the illegal slave trade a felony act. That is, it could result in your transportation to a penal colony for 14 years if you were engaging in it. That act in 1811 is telling us that the transatlantic slave trade, on the one hand, was not declining. In fact, it was increasing in the 1810s. And it's also telling us that the intercolonial slave trade to places like British Guyana and Trinidad was also not decreasing. It was growing. So London tries two responses, which are what get us to the Adelaide. One was to extend across all of the islands the 1812 Slave Registry Act, first tried in Trinidad, and so that was introduced in 1819. That was essentially a census system intended to monitor numbers, and that was examined yearly in London. The second approach was to try and reduce the categories of eligibility for transportation. This was done in two acts, in 1818 and 1824, which came into effect in 1825. Those restricted the eligible occupational groups to what was called domestic servants, household slaves only. And the 1824 Act also insisted that intercolonial transportation of enslaved people should not be detrimental to the slaves. That's the language of the Act itself. And specifically should not result in the breaking up of families. That was one of the goals of the 1824 Act, and insisted that the enslaved during transportation would be treated as passengers, not as cargo, which had a limited effect. In the Adelaide case, that idea is expressed by Captain Jones and others in the court as the spirit of the 1824 Act, about meaning that idea that this should be something that was not detrimental from the perspective of the enslaved. That framing, though, had a bad side effect, which is that slave owners and those transporting slaves then began to use the language of humanitarianism and benevolence in order to justify and explain their actions, as they used the humanitarian intents of the 1824 Act to cover or give a covering language to what they were engaged in. This too happens in the Adelaide case, as we'll see in just a second. The 1824 Consolidated Slave Trade Act was also in alignment with the directives to improve the conditions of slavery in the colonies, what we call the Amelioration Acts. And again, in Bermuda's case, the Bermuda House of Assembly does nothing about the amelioration instructions for 3 years and doesn't act on them. Bermuda's Governor Turner wrote the Colonial Office and said since 1823, Bermudians had been exporting what he called a considerable number of slaves to the Caribbean, specifically in anticipation of the Consolidated Slave Trade Act coming into force and making that more difficult to do. Meanwhile, what one governor of Trinidad called, quote, this deliberate and unfeeling traffic, end quote, in enslaved people continued into Trinidad, disguised now with the language of benevolence or hidden under that remaining category of domestic servant, the only legal category left. Of course, though, also central to this history are the actions of enslaved people themselves, their widespread resistance to transportation. They resisted relocation and insisted on the measures associated with improvement, leading, as you know, to a series of large-scale revolts in Barbados in 1816, Demerara 1823, and Jamaica in 1831. Okay, so that's all the context. I know that's an awful lot, but if we finally get back to the Adelaide. So the McAllisters had arrived in Bermuda in December 1826 on John Wainwright's ship, the Hummingbird. The reason Alexander McAllister gave for coming to Bermuda was that he was recovering from an illness. A plausible story. It might even be a true story, though not everybody believed him at the time. That was the reason for coming to Bermuda. According to McAllister, while he was recovering in a boarding house in Hamilton, he and his wife and daughter needed more help than the one free woman they had brought from Trinidad could provide. And so he says that he looked to hire help but couldn't find any. So he turned to the Royal Gazette instead. And there in the 23rd of December issue, an issue which unfortunately doesn't survive, he saw an auction notice indicating that Richard Wood was selling Hannah and a number of other individuals. He inquired at the Customs House in Hamilton about the legality of carrying Hannah and some of her children out of Bermuda. And he's told he would be fine as long as he met that 2 per owner or less rule. He said out of his humanity, he did not want to separate Hannah from her family, and so he purchased 4 of her children. He added for good measure that it was humane for him to reunite her with her son in Trinidad. He doesn't mention the other children that one record refers to as well. Now, the two younger children, as you know, were born after the 1821 Registry Act, and so he could not get the required documentation, a copy of their entry in the slave register, but he gets a waiver for that from the Customs House. The lack of occupation listed in the clearance papers, he gets a waiver from Government House for that as well. So it's in that context that William Jones seizes the Adelaide. How he came to know what was happening on the Adelaide is another story, which maybe we'll leave for later. But the case then proceeds to the Vice Admiralty Court here in Hamilton. Nathaniel Butler was out of the island at the time, and so the case came before the second judge of the Vice Admiralty Court, Henry Hunt, himself a merchant and one of the largest slaveholders in Bermuda at the time. Acting for Jones, because the Admiralty courts are civil law courts without juries, and so Jones doesn't argue his own case. His case is argued by the Attorney General, John Painter Mewson, and he argued that the paperwork requirements hadn't been met, and so any claim of humanity on the part of McAllister for his actions was simply irrelevant. He argued as well, that is, Mewson argued, it was incredible that such young people could provide any real domestic service to the Wainwrights or the McAllisters, and if not, why had he purchased them? And why were they on the ship at all, if it wasn't for the intent of permanently transferring them outside of Bermuda? And so, through John P. Mewson, Jones was arguing that the nature of McAllister's entire visit was suspect, that it was clearly intended for purchase, with prices in Bermuda about 1/3 to 1/10 of prices in Trinidad. So McAllister stood to gain, to enlarge his estate, as the court records suggest, by coming to Bermuda. And likely because he's a late arrival in Trinidad, he saw this as maybe the only way he could buy his way into becoming a sugar planter in Trinidad. Meanwhile, as the case proceeds in the Vice Admiralty Court, William Jones was collecting oral testimony from black Bermudians in Hamilton about what had happened. One witness, for instance, told him that Belinda, the young 6-year-old who had lost her mother just a little bit earlier, had been, quote, caught up like a fowl and put on board the Adelaide without a chance to speak to her father or her brother before the ship left. Despite these arguments, Henry Hunt made his decision quickly. And again, there's no jury, he makes a decision himself. Hunt decided that the lack of paperwork was simply the product of circumstances that were beyond the control of McAllister and Wainwright, and so not their fault. And he assumed that McAllister, having asked at the Customs House for advice, meant that he was well intended or had the best of intentions. And Hunt further declared that the children of someone listed as a domestic servant, in the case of Hannah listed as a laundress, could be taken to be domestic servants themselves, regardless of their age. And so the lack of occupation on the clearance papers was simply an oversight and was not relevant to the case. So, to make a long story short, Jones loses in the Vice Admiralty Court. He loses the case, his crew on the Orestes lose their prize money, all the property, human and otherwise, is returned to its owners, and not only is Jones out of the prize money, but Henry Hunt charges him with the costs of the trial. And there's a big stack of receipts in the Bermuda Archives in the Vice Admiralty Court case, adds up to about £50 or so a fairly substantial amount of money. Jones is devastated by the result. He wrote, quote, "The law, the only friend of the slave, is turned against him. The triumph of the slave dealers was complete," he continues. And he suggests, and again, he's probably being a little bit dramatic, that he was now being openly menaced by Bermuda slaveholders who, he said, were more worried about their property than their duty. The Royal Navy squadron at Dockyard stood helpless, Jones said, now that Henry Hunt's ruling was law, at least in terms of Bermuda. Governor Turner wrote the Colonial Office to say that Bermuda's traffic in the intercolonial slave trade, which he said had been concealed before, was now being openly conducted. The captain of the Adelaide, John Parentchief, told William Jones that he knew of another Bermuda ship leaving for Trinidad in a week's time with 15 to 20 enslaved people. The evidence of Jones, again, of a system of slave trading condoned by the Customs House. When word of Henry Hunt's decision arrived in London, the chief lawyer for the Colonial Office, James Stephen, wrote that, quote, "The prejudices of the judge had run away with him," end quote. Something had to be done, he thought. All of this matched what had been reported the year before by what was called a Commission of Legal Inquiry, which was sent by London to all of the island colonies to observe the conditions of the enslaved in those islands, but particularly the treatment of the enslaved in the local court systems. And across all the islands, the finding of the Commission of Legal Inquiry was that colonial courts could not be trusted to be impartial. They were simply too embedded in the local elites. And this seemed to confirm that in the eyes of the Colonial Office. So Jones loses the case, but what does that really, what matters? What's important about this? What does any of this really mean? Jones wasn't out of options. He could appeal the case to the High Court of Admiralty in London at the risk of losing again and being charged again with the costs of the case. He's encouraged to submit the appeal, though, by John Painter Newson, the Attorney General, who says that the central matter of fraud or intent was the critical issue. And he argued that even if Wainwright and McAllister believed that what they were doing was not committing fraud, nonetheless, that they could do so suggested how routine the fraud had become. That is, that there was a system of illegal slave trade. Jones' appeal, when he submits his appeal almost right away, creates this document, an inhibition, which was the High Court of Admiralty in London essentially stopping any transfer of any of the property, human and otherwise, the ship, until the case had been heard. So that's the first document there. The second document is a little bit later when the High Court of Admiralty begins to investigate the case. They issue this quite unusual monition, which is a rebuke to the Bermuda Vice Admiralty Court, a cautioning, a warning, specifically to Henry Hunt, saying that the case had been improperly heard and that the Vice Admiralty Court had not sent the proper documents to London and were required to do so. So this is a bit of an unusual rebuke, this monition. You might notice that both these documents are signed by William Henry, the Duke of Clarence, who was Lord High Admiral for just a brief period of time. He is the future King William IV, who comes to the throne in 1830, and he's known as the Sailor King because he was a naval officer for some time. Okay. And so the High Court of Admiralty by this point was beginning to be something of an antique. Charles Dickens, a little bit later in the 1850s, called the High Court, quote, a cozy, dozy, old-fashioned, time-forgotten, sleepy-headed little family party, end quote. Nonetheless, though, in the 1810s, 1820s, the High Court of Admiralty made important decisions that had tremendous impact and set precedents across the whole empire. Just the year before this case is heard, at the beginning of 1827, Lord Stowell, the ancient Chief Justice of the High Court of Admiralty, in his last decision in a case called the Slave Grace case, had determined that a woman named Grace, who had lived free in London in 1822, on her return to Antigua, was returned to a condition of slavery. That case was a major loss for the anti-slavery movement in London. And so the Adelaide appeal for the anti-slavery movement in London was a big risk too, a chance to regain ground, to reestablish some social and political and moral authority for the slave trade, the anti-slavery movement, but a risky chance nonetheless. Now, unfortunately, the High Court of Admiralty case file for the Adelaide appeal is missing. They can't find it. And I've had them ask them for months now, and they haven't been able to find it. But fortunately, a number of newspapers in London covered the case extensively with almost verbatim transcripts, which has been really, really useful. And then from those London newspapers, the colonial newspapers repeat the story, the Royal Gazette, locally here, of course. The Bermuda coverage, the Royal Gazette's coverage, focused on the question of why didn't McAllister, if this was really for help while he was here and ill, why didn't he just hire local help? And they really question that idea that he could not find any. And so that's kind of the take that they take. And they also take the position that why did he ask the Customs House officials for advice and not the law officers of the colony? So that's their take on it. For the Anti-Slavery Society in London, the Adelaide case becomes a major becomes a priority for them, I guess, put it that way. They assign the case to the chief consul for the Anti-Slavery Society, a man named Dr. Stephen Lushington, who was a brilliant lawyer, really the brains of the Anti-Slavery Society, a member of Parliament, and a really extraordinary guy himself. Just the year before, he had prosecuted a case of 11 children who were illegally transported from St. Kitts to Trinidad. In the audience watching the appeal were major figures in London anti-slavery: Thomas Buxton, Zachary Macaulay. In many ways, the Adelaide appeal, as it was heard over the winter of 1828, 1829, was the celebrity case in London. Lushington honed in on the central issue right away. To his view, the refusal of the Bermuda House of Assembly to renew the Slave Registry Act wasn't just incidental to the case, it was deliberate. It was part of a system, then, of evading the regulations required by imperial law. This is echoing then William Jones's claim of having found a system of slavery, not just an isolated incident. He argued, that is, Lushington argued, the Customs House in Bermuda was as responsible for this illegal transportation by having signed the documents as Henry Hunt was in not punishing it. He called it, quote, one of the worst cases of child robbing he had ever heard of. Lushington seems to have really wanted to make an example of McAllister, particularly because McAllister used the language of humanity to explain his actions. Lushington said McAllister could never feel compassion when he was, quote, carrying on this slave traffic of the worst description. He was looking to his God, and that God was mammon, end quote, money and greed. They were his God, Lushington said. That McAllister had consulted the Customs House for legal advice before purchasing Hannah's children was proof to Lushington that he purchased them for transportation, not for his family's needs in Bermuda. Lushington's opponents in the court, there's two aged conservative lawyers on the other side, Dodson and Nichols. Dodson and Nichols, they focused their defense on the one hand, that Bermudian officials were simply doing their best. And secondly, that the High Court should not be in a position of questioning the integrity of a colonial judge. Not very effective defenses, you might imagine. They accused Lushington, though, of being blinded by what they called a mistaken love of liberty for the slave. So, over the course of 3 months, the appeal circled around the question of intention. Had Wainwright and McAllister honestly tried to meet the legal requirements within circumstances outside of their control, that is, the missing slave register, or were they simply slave traders, part of a system of intercolonial illegality? Ultimately, the judge, Sir Christopher Robinson, he's unwilling to come down too strongly on either side, but he does overturn the Vice Admiralty Court's decision. That is, he reverses the lower court in Bermuda's decision. So he found both men, Wainwright and McAllister, guilty of violating the 1824 Consolidated Act because, as he said, neither Wainwright nor McAllister had any intention of returning the enslaved children to Bermuda. The High Court, for a time, even considers transporting to a penal colony Wainwright and McAllister for 14 years. They even consider for a time the possibility that the governor of Bermuda was in on this since he had signed one of the clearance papers as well. And then they decide that this is a step too far. However, despite the verdict, the High Court of Admiralty reduced the penalties to the minimum, that is the £100 fine per enslaved person and the loss of the ship, the Adelaide, out of Wainwright's pocket. Jones was repaid for his court costs in the lower court, and he had the satisfaction of winning, but none of the prize money that would have gone to him and his crew. Bermuda's Governor Turner wrote the Colonial Office that the case had excited the most intense interest in the colony and now stated his conviction that Wainwright and Parent-Chief had acted only with the best intentions. He endorsed the petition. John Wainwright gets a reduction on his penalty. Only Jones, though, pays attention really to the central matter, it seems to me, which is the children. Jones wrote that he was satisfied with the result and that he hoped it would serve as a warning in Bermuda, since the whole matter had been what he called a party affair, that is, a system, involving more than just two guilty parties, and was not an isolated incident. For Jones, the most important matter was that the supremacy of the law will be asserted, the intercolonial slave trade finally suppressed, and the 7 slaves will have their freedom. It wasn't lost on Jones that the loss of their human property wasn't just an additional fine to Wainwright and McAllister, rather the freedom of Hannah and her 6 children, the 6 children, was the central accomplishment of his appeal, an advancement in the pursuit of imperial anti-slavery. So the story plays at a local level, gets reversed in London, and then becomes a precedent across the empire. And just quickly, there are a number of of cases right after this, which then begin to turn their attention, using the Adelaide as a precedent, towards the illegal elements of the intercolonial slave trade. A case of the ship, the Beautiful Maid in Barbados, and Eliza Pratt, another ship, a Barbadian ship going to Trinidad, and so on. So there's a number of cases in which the Adelaide is directly and extensively cited in decisions that go against slave owners and lead to the emancipation of a number of children. Indirectly, the Adelaide discussions led to new regulations in 1828 that required owners to show legitimate possession and residency of the place they were purchasing enslaved people. And that is getting at the question of the intention of transportation. When the Customs House of Bermuda asked for clarification about what to do, what had they done, what they ought to do, that led Customs House London to introduce a new regulation which came into effect in 1831, which banned entirely the transportation of children, except for the cases of nursing infants accompanying their mothers. And so the Adelaide, both indirectly and then directly, led to a number of substantial shifts in the intercolonial slave trade, and really marked a transition in the status and the influence of the anti-slavery society in London itself. In the next 4 years, the West India lobby would introduce 4 bills to British Parliament asking for the entire reopening of the intercolonial slave trade. Every one of them fails. The moment had shifted as a result of that. Now, what happens to them afterwards? The men we can talk about a little bit, but finally, most importantly, what happened to Hannah and the children? I was hoping this week, I still hope to find in the archive during the course of this week, what has happened to Hannah and her children, but the other 2 children, Bob and Belinda, who have been taken from their slaveholders. Perhaps it is enough, as it was for Jones, to know that Hannah and her 6 children were freed in 1829 as a result of the legal proceedings, but it is nonetheless a partial achievement. There's still the unnamed son in Trinidad and Hannah's other children in Bermuda, whose status is unclear. That it isn't clear what happens to them is a reminder of the way archival traces distort and erase the experiences and voices of enslaved people, especially of enslaved women and children. But so too can subsequent stories. Neither Jean Kennedy nor Henry Wilkinson mention the names of the enslaved, though they are mentioned dozens and dozens of times in hundreds of pages of documents. That's the result of framing a story in which the enslaved had no political agency, in which the broader abolitionist movement played little role in local dramas, a story about the slave trade in which slaves are barely mentioned. But we don't need to keep doing that. That people like Hannah were denied the opportunity to write their own history does not mean they did not have a history. Of course not. Slaveholders may have been the first historians of slavery, shaping the narrative, revealing the tension between what they wanted to know, wanted to be known, and what they knew to be true. But enslaved and freed people were historians of themselves, gathering, preserving, and sharing information about themselves and their community. We have the case of the witness who reports what has happened to Belinda, caught up like a fowl. Hannah knew where her son was, and being reunited with him had positive value to him. We cannot redeem or recover or save people from the archive of slavery. The past is gone, but we can reconsider their lives and their history, and we can return to their stories again, and we can try to tell their stories in ways that might be recognizable to them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, for such an insightful lecture. Now we have some time for questions from the audience. Anyone have any questions before we head out?
How did you find out about this story?
I was going through the Colonial I was going through the Colonial Office records for something else, which was related to the talk I gave for the Maritime Museum, the National Museum, I should say, about black women marketing goods at Dockyard. And so I was reading through Colonial Office correspondence looking for that, and then there was this discussion about children and about the nature of slavery in which infants could be classified as domestic servants. And so it was largely accidental. And it was only later that I thought to look in Jean Kennedy's book and Henry Wilkinson, where there's, again, a couple of paragraphs. Not very good, but there's a couple of paragraphs on it. I had no idea, though, that this had substantial play in London in the newspapers and had become a cause célèbre, and then actually ends up changing the intercolonial slave trade laws.
From when William Jones found them on the ship to when they were freed, what were they doing? Like, did they have to work as slaves, or are you not sure?
Well, that is another thing I hope to uncover this week. So what happens to them, the language of the court, is that when they are taken at the beginning of the Vice-Admiralty Court proceedings, and so the whole, the property is seized, they become what were called king's slaves, so they become government property for the period of the case, and then they are returned as a result of Jones losing the case. What they're doing, though, when they are king's slaves is not very clear, and there are not good records about that category. There are lots of other, not lots, but there are a number of other people in that category, but it's not well recorded, so I don't really know, unfortunately. And given that many were children, probably nothing. They were under the care of Hannah, I assume.
Okay. Well, that concludes tonight's program. Thank you all for coming out this evening as we honor those who laid the foundation of our shared legacy. We also extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who made tonight possible. Before we go, we kindly ask if you scan the QR code on the back of your program to share your feedback. It helps us to continue to bring meaningful events like this to the community. We now invite you to some refreshments at the back and more conversation. Thank you.